It's a class I designed some years ago. So some of the stuff is from that. So I just want to spend a couple of days. It's really like kind of historical flip notes kind of things. This may be stuff you may have had in grade school and that before we get into the Constitution. So, and I think there's a couple of questions on the test about kind of Illinois history on the Constitution test. I'll give you guys a handout. I'm not going to go into much detail. For whatever reason on the test, they still do this. They did this when I was a kid. It's that whole, and probably when you guys took this last time, the whole like state flower, state fossil, stuff like that. I'm just going to give you guys a handout on that. I'm not going to spend a whole lot. Like the states, there's a state snap. Right. Those are some of those questions on the test, which I think is ridiculous, but it is what it is. So I'll give you guys a handout on that. I won't go into a whole bunch of detail with it. So the thing is about Illinois history, a lot of cases here, what they tend to start out with is kind of talking about this region before we're going to kind of their history is the path to kind of statehood. 1818 is the year in which Illinois became a state. But this region, initially, like particularly down the street, we have kind of a sizable kind of settlement there. Initially, this region was actually kind of north of Mexico, was a large concentration of individuals. So, kind of in Illinois history, a lot of times, like when I did talk to Illinois history class, like after geography, the unit on geography, we talk about native culture. All right, which still some people like today, a lot of people will kind of like, I've had students that showed me like arrowheads that they found in their backyard or whatever. And this area was kind of the epicenter for some native cultures that consider their birthplace, like the Cherokee and Choctaw, stuff like that. So when we talk about native cultures, we generally kind of divide them into what we call kind of prehistoric and historic. And the thing that kind of separates, and I talk about in my world history class, the thing that separates history from prehistory from history is the evidence of writing. So like the kind of prehistoric cultures here, right? Like in history here, the early prehistoric cultures, they tend to be what we call like kind of nomadic or semi-nomadic, right? Have you ever heard the term nomadic before? Yeah. What does it mean to be a nomad? Isn't it like a traveling? Yeah, you move around. All right. So the kind of earliest habitation of what is Illinois kind of post-glacial kind of period here, they kind of generally kind of put into this classification of paleo. Paleo is a term that means ancient, simply. The idea with this here is that basically a lot of the evidence that's left behind here with this kind of classification are generally artifacts, right? And a lot of times the separation between paleo and the next classification is generally the use of kind of tools that are being used. So these are the kind of inhabitants of this area that basically came across what is the contemporary idea across what they call Bergenia, which is basically the land bridge that separates basically kind of really Asia from North America, right? And you guys probably, when you guys were in grade school, did a unit on Native Americans. This is essentially paleo. That's what the classification of these early inhabitants that eventually kind of spread all the way through the Americas, all right? Around 8,000 or so anthropologists, archaeologists, the people that deal with kind of analyzing artifacts and fossil remains, start to notice a difference in the types of kind of tools that are being used. All right, you see a number of tools that are being used mainly for the advancement of hunting. So things like the atoll, which was basically kind of a spear with a kind of a handle on it. These things called bolas, which were these essentially kind of the kind of rocks being kind of tied together and being thrown at the kind of the legs of smaller game. That starts to appear at this time. So they kind of the variations are based on artifacts that are found in that area. So the dates tend to be what we say arbitrary to a certain extent. But again, still primarily kind of nomadic, semi-nomadic. And so this kind of, again, this culture, archaic and paleo are these kind of terms that don't really signify any real difference in, let's say, cultural aspects. It's mainly kind of when it comes to kind of tools and weapons and that, primarily for hunting. All right. And then eventually we start to see other tools that start to emerge, like adazes and axes for clearing land, which probably indicates that we start to see the emergence of agriculture. Right? And so what anthropologists and archaeologists refer to that kind of next phase would be the woodland era. Right? You have early, middle, and late woodland periods here. This is, they believe, kind of the first native culture to establish permanent settlements, right? And what you'll find here is like kind of the middle woodland era is the era that we find the most amount probably of artifacts and that. This is a group they refer to as the Hopewell. And this is the same culture that you'll find like in the Hopewell kind of extends from like kind of Illinois, Missouri, all the way through Ohio Valley down through like the South, like Alabama and that area there. There were Hopewell settlements that were found like Carlisle, like some years ago, they believe were Hopewell. What they had this idea was they found a number of these kind of mounds. These were the first ones that are kind of building mounds, although they're not known as the mound builders. And in those mounds, they found remains, like artifacts and remains. And some of these, they would have like, items that they were buried with, like kind of like we start to see things like jewelry, tools and stuff like that. So the indication, if you're buried with these items, what do you think this culture believed in? If you're being like the Egyptians, when the pharaohs are buried with all their stuff, yeah. Yeah, you take it, it's constantly becomes something in afterlife. That's a theory. But again, the problem is that this culture does not leave behind what to fill in the entire story. Written records, all right? So this is, you find woodland, kind of Hopewell kind of sites that are around this area, all right? Probably the most famous one is in Ohio, though. There's this kind of, this thing called the Serpent Mound in Chillicothe, Ohio. It's essentially just basically, you can't see it from the ground, it just looks like kind of earthenwork. But from above, it's you can tell that it looks like a snake, looks like a serpent. So, like in this area right here, we're part of what archaeologists refer to as the crab orchard culture of the Hopewell, and there's a little bit of what they call the Havana Hopewell. But all these are kind of like a connection, and there's some evidence that may have been traded with one another. All right. The late woodland period is often referred to as this culture, which is closest to us, right? And that's the Mississippians. The Mississippians were the ones who inhabited Cahokia. And we kind of take Cahokia for granted, right? But probably right now there's archaeologists, like from the University of Illinois has a lot of archaeology students here. This was the largest concentration of people north of Mexico, north of what we call Mesoamerica, prior to the arrival of the Europeans. It wasn't until probably like 1799 that when Philadelphia, the population of Philadelphia exceeded like 25,000, that that was like kind of the largest concentration of people since then. Anywhere between 10 to 20,000, right? Cahokia was essentially like kind of Washington D.C. and New York, if you will, for the Mississippi culture. And this culture, like the Hopewell, kind of extends into Ohio, down in the South. There's a place in Alabama they call Moundville that is like a small version of Cahokia. It's almost like kind of a replica of that. So I have like a book on like all like these 500 like kind of archaeological sites, and smack dab in the middle of the book is Cahokia. Right? Although they say it's East St. Louis, they don't give it the credit to Collinsville. And again, like with the Hopewell, you have a lot of these cultures that they tend to kind of identify using different names and such. I had a professor I was watching something that was part of a archaeological group that they found a Mississippian site that was just outside of O'Fallon. And they determined that it was probably kind of like a suburb of Cahokia, if you will. So if you ever go to the interpretive center, this is the indication, kind of like you see this kind of image here. Now I have this video here that I showed in like kind of like class where this is from a series called 500 Nations, which talks about all these native cultures here, and they kind of focus on very basic things.
Along the Mississippi River, 6 miles from present-day St. Louis, Missouri, there stood a city that once dominated the heart of the continent. At its center was a powerful leader.
A great number of years ago, there appeared among us a man who came down from the sun. This man told us that he had seen from on high that we did not govern ourselves well, that we had no master, that each of us had presumption enough to think himself capable of governing others, while he could not even conduct himself.
1,000 years ago, the great sun, a leader who was both king and pope, lived atop a man-made royal mountain 10 stories high. its 16-acre base larger than any pyramid in Egypt.
He told us that in order to live in peace among ourselves, we must observe the following points. We must never kill anyone but in defense of our own lives. We must never know any woman besides our own. We must never take any things that belong to another. We must never lie, nor get drunk. We must not be avaricious. We must give generously and with joy and share our subsistence with those who are in need of it.
From the heights of his royal estate, the great sun mediated between the Creator and the people, between the sun and the earth. This is Cahokia, city of the sun. The great sun ruled the thriving center of a vast Mississippian culture. Outside the walled city, communities of farmers, hunters, and fishermen stretched for miles, surrounded by fields of corn. With 20,000 residents, no city in the United States would surpass Cahokia's historic size before 1800. Only then would Philadelphia's population eclipse the ancient center.
These people lived in daub and wattle houses on top of the principal people did, the priest and the royalty. They lived in very substantial houses, not teepees, not teepees. Teepees, Western Plains people. Down here, they lived in houses. They were sedentary. They were farmers. They used the rivers and the bars and the streams as not only for commerce, but for sustenance as well.
With the Mississippi and other major rivers as its highways, Cahokia was linked by trade to a third of the continent. Copper arrived from the Great Lakes, obsidian from Yellowstone, mica and crystal from the Appalachians, gold and silver from Canada, shell from the Gulf of Mexico.
Look at these old live oak trees that have seen so much pass by them. Magnificently dressed Indian people coming down that bar in a dugout, greeting people, standing right here on this bank, having a good time because they did. You know, Indian people have always known how to have a good time. And there would be a feast prepared. The women would put the corn together. They'd make softki. They would roast a deer. People would bring gifts. You never go to an Indian's house without bringing something that was old as the sunrise.
Cahokia was the pinnacle of a mound-building culture with traditions dating back as a powerful leader.
A great number of years ago, there appeared among us a man who came down from the sun. This man told us that he had seen from on high that we did not govern ourselves well, that we had no master, that each of us had presumption enough to think himself capable of governing others, while he could not even conduct himself.
1,000 years ago, the great sun, a leader who was both king and pope, lived atop a man-made royal mountain 10 stories high. Its 16-acre base larger than any pyramid in Egypt.
He told us that in order to live in peace among ourselves, we must observe the following points. We must never kill anyone but in defense of our own lives. We must never know any woman besides our own. We must never take any things that belong to another. We must never lie, nor get drunk. We must not be avaricious. We must give generously and with joy, and share our subsistence with those who are in need of it.
From the heights of his royal estate, the great sun mediated between the Creator and the people, between the sun and the earth. This is Cahokia, city of the sun. The great sun ruled the thriving center of a vast Mississippian culture. Outside the walled city, communities of farmers, hunters, and fishermen stretched for miles, surrounded by fields of corn.
So this is at its height, like I said, about 20,000 people there. We take for granted Monk's Mound, if you will, but keep in mind this is kind of it's an earthenwork. All right, the Mississippians didn't have access to wheel or beast of burdens, for hauling and stuff like that. And it's like during the solstice, I know they'll usually have people kind of come there for the sunrise. You'll have native cultures from the Cherokee, Choctaw, that all kind of consider Cahokia kind of the epicenter. And then I don't know if you guys kind of head into kind of like State Park in that area. There's a replica of what are called Woodhenge, which is basically probably what they believe is a sundial. All right. So this is something, like I said, we kind of take for granted here, but this is like a major, this is like a kind of a major archaeological site that when dealing with kind of pre-Columbian or pre-arrival Europeans, people tend to kind of look at. However, around 1400, Cahokia is basically abandoned. Similar thing happened down in Mesoamerica with the Mayans and stuff like that. There's a number of kind of theories, if you will. By the time the French arrived, right, who were the first Europeans to kind of come into this area, the tribes that are occupying what we know as Illinois are referred to as the Illini, if you will. That's where Illinois gets its name, obviously, right? The Illini were an Algonquin-speaking people, and they were kind of maybe classified as like a confederation. 5 main tribes, right? And you see names for cities and rivers and stuff like that. Kaskaskia, Peoria, Cahokia. Obviously, where the name Cahokia comes from is the fact that when the French arrived, it was the Cahokia tribe that was kind of in the area. Tamora, Michigan, right? And so at times they would fight amongst each other, and other times they would kind of align as other native cultures kind of came into here. They generally developed a kind of a friendly relationship with the French. This is why we kind of consider the first historic one, because we have direct written kind of evidence. Marquette and Joliet, where Marquette State Park is named after, were the first kind of French Europeans to kind of come into this area here. They were the first ones to notice, and probably the one thing that's kind of, other than the name Illinois, kind of a famous structure that's kind of left behind in this area here is, you guys know what that is? Yeah, it's a Pius Alberta. It's kind of the current one is kind of a replica of where the original one was. And so just kind of up there by Alton. There's a whole legend story that I used to read that kind of goes with that, but that's associated with the Illini. However, as we start to see Europeans kind of settling into places along the East Coast and stuff, we start to see more and more native cultures being pushed into Illinois, kind of challenging the Illini and that. The Meskwaki, who are more commonly known as the Fox, mainly kind of in the northern part of Illinois, there's the Fox River, which is obviously named after them. At one point, another native culture, right, the Sauk, which these are both have some similarities with the Illini. They're both Algonquin speaking, but at times, again, kind of infringing upon territories. These kind of groups would kind of engage in kind of conflict with the Illini. But this is primarily in kind of northern Illinois in this area, all right. And so there's a number of kind of rivers and towns and stuff like that that are named after kind of both of these tribes in that area. Also in the northern part, a group called the Seneca, which were part of another confederation called the Iroquois. The Seneca originally kind of New York, but there was a segment of the Seneca that kind of pushed west into Illinois. The Iroquois were aligned with the British. They're essentially, we start to see native culture start to kind of align with either the French or the British. This is going to come to a kind of a head here when we talk about something called the French and Indian War, mainly kind of from a kind of a British perspective. Right. I think there's a town in Seneca, Illinois, up there. It's named after. But the Iroquois, like the Illinois, are part of a confederation of like 5 main tribes: the Onondaga, Cayuga, Seneca. The Iroquois League was one of the Iroquois ones who invented lacrosse, the game lacrosse, right? And the Iroquois League kind of established something that was very similar, like when later the Arts Confederation were being put together. Benjamin Franklin cited the Iroquois League as a kind of example of that. And then another tribe, the Winnebago. There's a county up in northern Illinois named after them. Now, the Winnebago, a relatively small tribe that actually had lines with the Illinois. However, there was a story I found when I was doing my research for a local history class. There was after a kind of a celebration to honor the Illini, the Winnebago turned on them, and the numbers vary from the, but it's like there was like 500 Illini kind of warriors that were killed after this ceremony, and the Illini turned on them completely, almost wiped them out. There was one author that said there was like 150 Winnebago left. They were all made into slaves by the Illini. The Illini, the name means the men in Algonquin, by the way. And so there's an extensive kind of like history that's in social structure that's established by them. And then closer to us, southern Illinois, the Shawnee are a native tribe that we see Shawnee National Forest named after them. In this area, there was another kind of non-Algonquin group called the Kickapoo. They were essentially in kind of Connellsville and Edwardsville. All these tribes, like the Kickapoo, are mainly in Oklahoma. A lot of these tribes, if they're left, are really the only Illini tribe that's left of the Peoria that are in Oklahoma. A lot of this is related to kind of forced relocation after statehood, after the kind of federal government is established. There was a kind of a treaty, but it was really kind of a forced kind of evacuation that's just started down the street in 1818 with the Treaty of Edwardsville. This was soon after Illinois became a state, and this is the last occasion the Illini kind of acted as a kind of a nation, right? Essentially, they were kind of forced off the land, and they were kind of basically later kind of relocated. Later, when they talk about something kind of like the Trail of Tears, they're relocated to Oklahoma, which they refer to as Indian Territory. And a lot of these other cultures, like the Shawnee and the Kickapoo and all that, were kind of basically kind of seen to follow. Right. So, like I said, in 1818 is a significant year. That's when Illinois gains statehood. So I want to talk tomorrow about things like kind of the French and Indian War, American Revolution, and then like kind of like the emergence of Illinois as a state in 1818, which was the same year Wisconsin became a state. And with that, there was also an important kind of agreement with the latitude lines that allowed Chicago to remain in Illinois. So again, this is kind of historical clip notes here for this stuff. Like I said, I'm going to get through this, and then we'll get into the nitty gritty of government stuff that you guys need to know for the test.